بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله عليه وسلم. Jazakallah khair for joining us today. We're doing our second session on our Seerah series. Last week, alhamdulillah, we discussed a very important topic in terms of talking about why we should study the Seerah. And it may seem like a mundane thing to talk about, but it's important because it gives us perspective. It gives us the right framework, the right mindset of how we're supposed to approach this study. So now, as I mentioned last week, it's going to take us a few sessions before we even get to the birth of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There's so much to discuss. We have to set the background. We have to understand the political times. We have to understand the social aspects, what the religion of the people of the Arab were, why the Arabian Peninsula was the place where Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was sent, or why the Quran was revealed there. There's so much to talk about. And it's important because we need to understand these concepts to fully appreciate how Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam took a community who are arguably the darkest society that times have ever seen. And in 23 years of Nubuwwah and in 63 years of life, he turned them from the darkest society to the greatest society known to man. And to truly appreciate that, we have to understand the full picture. And concepts are often understood and appreciated by analyzing their opposites. So we can't appreciate the light unless we've gone through darkness. We can't appreciate the heat unless we've gone through cold and so on. So when we delve into the ignorant period of pre-Islamic Arabia, which is, the time of Jahiliyyah, it allows that, also known as the age of ignorance, it allows us to further appreciate and internalize the blessing that is Islam, the light that is Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the blessing that he is. There's a common saying that you can only appreciate the beauty of roses when it's amongst thorns. And so that's what makes the life of the Prophet Muhammad such a miracle and how he was able to transform. So Rasulullah ﷺ was sent to the Arabs, the Arab people, but he was sent to mankind, but he comes from the Arabs. And the word Arab refers to the place, name of the people, and culture. And so today, what we want to do is understand who these people were. We want to know what their situation was. What are they capable of? And oftentimes when we talk about these things, we talk about only the bad. We talk about only the bad things that they were doing before Islam came, before Rasulullah had received revelation. But the reality is that in order for them to transform from, a very bad society to a very good one, they had to have the potential to transform into a good society, which means that they actually had a lot of good qualities as well. So we're going to talk about both the bad and the good today. Why was Rasulullah sent amongst these people and why the Quran was revealed in this language? So the word Arab, in its absolute root, refers to something that flows, something that runs. And it's referred to someone who speaks clearly. So the non-Arabs, they are referred to in the Arabic language as Ajam, right? So Ajam literally means someone who doesn't speak, but it is used in a way that someone who, doesn't speak clearly, right? So an Arab is someone who speaks clearly, and Ajam is not one who speaks clearly. And that's not meant to be an insult to anybody or anything like that. It's just the definition of the word. And so their speech, it says that the speech of the Arabs, it flowed and ran like no other form of speech, right? And that's why the Quran is revealed in the Arabic language, right? So we do believe that the Arabic language, it has a certain level of, honor to it because it was revealed, the Quran was revealed in that language, and the Quran is the kalam of Allah. Now, there are other forms of the word Arab, right? There's Yu'rabu, which the Rasulullah ﷺ refers to many times in many different narrations. And when he says that, he uses it to refer to someone to speak clearly or to clearly articulate. And the Arabs, they had a term for someone who speaks very clearly, where they would call him Arabaniyul Lisan, that he's someone who speaks very clearly. And then there's also the term Urub, right? For example, in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَجَعَلْنَاهُنَّ أَبَكَارًا عُرُبًا أَتْرَابًا. That, in Jannah, our spouses are going to be of loving and equal age. But urb isn't just a love, it's a deep, passionate love. And so another term or another root from the word Arab is the term Arabat, right? So for example, which means when something becomes chaotic or loses order. So the Arabs, they have this saying that, for example, like someone's stomach is hurting, so they'll say Arabat mi'datuhu, that his stomach has lost control, his stomach is in chaotic order. So when a stream runs or a river runs, we're talking about the Arab language being like a running river. The water is also flowing in all different directions. It's not necessarily organized. You can call it maybe a controlled chaos. So to a greater extent, what's beautiful about the word Arab itself is that it actually describes the people. It describes the fact that they were articulate in speech. It describes the fact that they were passionate people. Arab, they had a lot of passion. They had trouble containing their emotions. There was a lot of chaos amongst the Arabs, right? They didn't have any established form of governance or economics or centralized religion to unite them. So when Islam was introduced to these people as a centralized religion, it brought about a form of governance, an economic system, which contributed to the organization of these people. And the Arab race itself was divided into two subcategories. There are something called the ancient Arabs or the perished Arabs, where there's not a lot known about them. There's not a lot about them that remains outside of the religious tradition we have. And these are the Arabs that are from Ad and Thamud. Right? So Hud alayhi salam from the people of Ad, and Salih alayhi salam was sent to the people of Thamud. These people are the perished Arabs. There's not much that we know about them outside of the religious scripture about them, the people of Ad and Thamud that we have. Then there are the Arabs who remained, also known as the migrated Arabs, right? And these are the Arabs at the time of Rasulullah, and these were the Arabs that were at the epicenter of the Arabian Peninsula. But the Arabs in that region, they migrated there from other regions. So amongst the migrated Arabs, there are two subcategories of the migrated Arabs. There are what is called the pure Arabs and the Arabized Arabs. So the pure Arabs are those who came from the modern day Yemen region, okay? Not from Egypt, okay? Everybody, Egyptians think they're pure, they're not. I'm Egyptian, I can say that. There was a great flood in the time in that area in Yemen. So a lot of the pure Arabs of Yemen, they migrated to the Hijaz, the Arabian Peninsula area. And then there were also other Arabs who migrated to Hijaz even before the flood due to economic troubles. And then there were the Arabized Arabs, right? These are the Arabs that come from the lineage of Ismail alayhi salam. So Ismail alayhi salam is not someone who was ethnically Arab, but he became Arab in terms that he married into an Arab family, and also he spoke the Arabic language, and so his children became Arabized in a sense. So as Islam spread, the Arabic language and the Arab culture also spread along with it. And that's where the vast majority of modern day Arabs are these kind of Arabs, these Arabized Arabs, if you will. And the progeny of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ comes from the Arabized Arabs. Now, let's talk about the geography about the Arabian Peninsula. So if you want to put a mental picture in your head, it's important to realize or understand the location because it has an impact on what we're going to talk about. So if you just picture the Arabian Peninsula, I should have maybe brought a map or something, but it's okay. A picture from the Arabian Peninsula, and you have like the north or the northeast to the mid-northwestern region. The Arabian Peninsula, that whole area is completely surrounded by water. So in the northeast, you have the Persian Gulf, and then it continues with the Strait of Hormuz, and then the Gulf of Oman in the east, and then there's the Arabian Sea in the southeast region. Then there's the Gulf of Aden in the south region, and then there's the Bab al-Mandab Strait, which is in the southwest, and then there's the Red Sea in the West Peninsula. And then in the northern region, that only area that's not covered by water in the Arabian Peninsula, it borders the ancient region of Bilad al-Sham, modern day Syria. So because of this, the Arabian Peninsula was very internal. Land-wise, there was only one entrance into the Arabian Peninsula, and that was through the Syrian desert. You have to travel hundreds or thousands of miles just to get there. So because of this, the Arabs had a very internalized setting. They were isolated from outside influences. So you had this kind of cushioned lifestyle where external factors didn't really impact you that much. And so because of that, it meant that the Arabian Peninsula was a hotbed of deep cultural tradition, right? Deep linguistic nuance. And it was a treasure because not a lot of cultures came in to impact the Arabian Peninsula. The Arabian Peninsula also was very exposed in terms of sea and ocean. So therefore, it served as a primary port for many keys of trading and traveling routes. So even though the governance itself, the isolation of the Arabian Peninsula was a thing, it was also the epicenter for trade and business. And there wasn't a lot of government interest either, because running a government or invading the Arabian Peninsula was a very difficult endeavor. You'd have to completely cut off from this arm of your government that extends within the region. And so that's why in the Arabian Peninsula, even though we had great big armies like the Persian Empire and the Roman Empire, they didn't really have a lot of interest in actually invading the Arabian Peninsula, because it was difficult to even get your arm in there, and then even when you did, it just wasn't very beneficial to them. Now, there's a lot of politics of the Arabian Peninsula. At the time of Rasulullah's birth, and even at the time of Revelation, the Yemen area, the Hijaz area, had been a battleground between Christians and Jews for hundreds of years. They fought for kingship in that town. Judaism had found itself a home in Yemen. Right? The Christian kingdom in Abyssinia, which is the story of how Abraha came about and the story of the elephants, which we'll talk about later on, they came in originally and took over Yemen. But closer to the time of prophethood of Rasulullah, there was an uprising. A Persian influence came into Yemen and backed some of the Jews and the local Arab polytheists and idol worshippers of Yemen, and they were able to overthrow the Christian Abyssinian king, ruler of Yemen. So because of this, the Persian rule came into power, and the local Arab tribes were the ones that were put into power, and it was, the Yemen region was essentially part of the Persian rule. Now, the last of the Persian rulers, by someone named Badahan, accepted Islam during the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ. And the Prophet ﷺ sent Ali ibn Abi Talib and Mu'adh ibn Jabal anhum to Yemen to teach the people about Islam. Now, in current day Iraq, the ancient classical region, which is current day Iraq, there was mostly a Persian influence which remained even during the time of Rasulullah ﷺ, but during the Khilafah of Umar ibn Khattab, the local Arabs were able to regain the region for themselves, but for only less than a year. And then Khalid bin Walid, at the helm of the Muslim army, came and overtook that region again, and then that region came under the rule of Islam. Now in Syria, or the classic region of Bilad al-Sham, which is towards the north, Syria was mostly a Roman Catholic influence, a Roman Christian influence. And this also came under Islamic rule during the time of the Khilafah of Umar ibn Khattab. So the Arabian Peninsula did not have a centralized law or government. The entire region was ruled by tribal law. There was a lot of intertribal warfare, or the tribal law was seen similar to kingship. So if there was personal conflicts, it would become tribal conflicts. So if I'm from one tribe and I'm beefing with somebody else from another tribe, it's not just me and him that are beefing together, it's both tribes beefing together, right? And they were so, protective of their tribes. So that's actually one of the good qualities gone bad of the Arabs, that they were protective people, which is good, but if it's not done correctly, it can be bad. So if you're of a more noble tribe and your son had harassed a more noble tribe's leader's son, not only will your son get it, you'll probably get it too, even though you had nothing to do with it, right? So tribal leadership is where the chieftains of the tribes, they often enforce rulings like a king, right? No questions asked. And it would be passed down in the family lines similar to monarchy. But because of this type of corrupt governance, there was not great preservation of people's rights. If you were wealthy, if you were influential, if you were related to a tribal leader, you had a connection with them, maybe you have something to offer to the leaders, then you would be okay. But if you belong to a class or a society that was maybe out of favor or maybe, considered at the time irrelevant or not of concern, then you did not enjoy the same liberties at that time. So people that bordered the Syrian region, those who were under the Christian influence, those Arabs were actually treated as second-class citizens. Right? Even though they were under the same rule, they did not enjoy the same rights that the Christians enjoyed. But in the heart of the Hijaz, there was no centralized law. So even the Arabs who did not have complete autonomy, even the Arabs who were seen as second class by the other tribes, were envied by the Syrian Arabs, because at least they had autonomy, right, to some degree, and were not subject to foreign invasion or rule. Now, the leaders of the tribe, which at the time was Banu Kinan and Quraysh, they were also seen as the servants and the custodians of the sacred house of the Kaaba. So they weren't just political leaders and economic leaders, but they were also seen as religious leaders, and they would dictate the law of the land. So one of the good qualities here of the Arabs is that they actually loved to serve the people that came to the Kaaba, right? But then again, as we see time and time again in pre-Islamic Arabia, good quality gone bad, they would actually fight with one another to try to see and go to war with one another to see who would be the ones taking care of the Kaaba and serving the pilgrims the Kaaba. So the tribal leader was not only there to set laws and dictate rulings to people, but you would also see that leader walking around and giving water to the Hujjaj. And from there, you can kind of see where the cultural seed of Islamic behavior is coming about, even pre-Islam. Now, the social life of the Arabs was an interesting mix of different social constructs, where there was both negative things and there was both positive things. In terms of negative things, there was a lack of fair treatment. Slavery was very prevalent, and those who were in bondage were treated very horribly, even lesser than animals, right? So your horse and your camel would get superior treatment to someone that you have under bondage, and which was, something that Islam came to rectify. Another thing is women in pre-Islamic society had two opposite experiences. In certain social circles, women were unfortunately and wrongly treated as subhuman, right? They were a commodity, if you will, that would be passed on from family to family or be passed on from man to man. You can kind of understand what I'm getting to here when I mention, so I'm not going to say it explicitly. But when it came to the elite of society, those women who had higher, in terms of families and tribal leadership, those women were held in great esteem. They were honored, they were respected, they were given power and decision-making. Their opinions were crucial in a lot of major decisions. They even owned land and wealth. One of the great examples of this is our mother Khadija radiallahu anha, the first wife of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Another example of this is Hind. Hind, the wife of Sufyan, was a key contributor in why the Battle of Uhud happened. And when Abu Sufyan accepted Islam, Hind, even though his wife, actually was one of the first to oppose him. And eventually, Hind ended up accepting Islam towards the end of Rasulullah's life. Now, another thing is that money and leadership of tribes was passed down from families. Right? If you're born into poverty, you most likely stayed there because of so many social obstacles. The social statuses, they played a role in the moral and ethical culture in the time of the Arabs. So if you committed wrong to someone who was of higher social status than you, then you would probably get killed, whether your crimes were warranted or not. And if you committed wrong to someone who was of a lower status than you, then you would probably get away with it. As you can see, subhanAllah, there's a lot of similarities with current today's society and pre-Islamic Arabia. Just keep that in mind next time you hear people say progress, okay? In terms of family, you had opposite extremes. So in the elite society, family was very important. Marriage was treated as very sacred. So a man would go propose to a woman, would offer her a gift, a mahar, and treat his wife with great respect. And in pre-Islamic Arabia, there was four types of marriage. 4 types of marriage. There's the modern day type Muslim marriage that we see, which I just described. Proposal, mahar, contract agreement, right? Both respected parties and loyal to each other, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? The second type of marriage was a marriage that was not treated as sacred, where the spouses would know about each other's infidelity and they didn't care. They were cool with it. The second type is, this one's kind of strange, but it was a communal fornication. So there would be no marriage. But what happened is that if a woman wanted to have a child, she would go somewhere where there would be a bunch of men, a set of group men, and then they would do their thing. And then after she would get pregnant, she would decide who gets to be the father. Just absurd, right? And the kid would be raised by whatever man they decided to be the father. Then there was a fourth one, which is the only way I can really describe it is just straight up prostitution, right? Where there would be residences that were marked off, and you would know based on the mark that this is a place where you can, engage in immoral behavior and, pay for it. And the children of these women would be called walad zina, even though the two previous examples were also examples of zina. And these children had no status in society, so no one would claim them. And these children lived a life of disgrace, which is really unfortunate because we believe, right? That you do not hold a burden of more than you can bear. So no one holds the burden of the sins of anybody else. The Prophet ﷺ, in a narration, he talks about these forms of marriages. And he says that the latter three forms of marriage have been abolished, forbidden in Islam. And the only one that remains and the only one that's acceptable is the first form, which is the Islamic nikah that we have today. Now, the primary form of making a living at the time of the pre-Islamic Arabia was through trade and business, especially with outside regions. There was some farming within the central regions of Arabia, but overall it was rare. There was not a lot of natural resources that would come into Arabia, so trade was essential. And the entire economic structure was based on trade and business. Just like if anybody's familiar with American economy today, the entire American economic system is revolved around the housing system, mortgages and real estate and etc. So similar to that, the whole entire economic system of the Arabs was relying on trade and business. But because of political instability, sometimes the economic situation would get really unstable. And so bad economic situations also led to political instability. And political instability led to a lot of economic instability. And it just went in a circle. It was a very, very vicious circle. And because of that, there was no middle class in Arabia. You're either poor or you're wealthy. There's no in between. You were very elite or you were poor. And the latter was way more common. Now let's talk about some positives of the Arabian people. They had a deep emotional attachment to family, right? And being good to your family. The farther you went into tribal and nomad life, the more you found this experience, that family relations were maintained as sacred. Hospitality was a very big deal. It was so big of a deal that it was almost to a fault. Because there was no hotels, there was no restaurants, there's no grocery stores, no travelers to depend on and etc. So travelers would depend on the hospitality of the goodwill of the people. So in the spirit of the hospitality, they would actually often jeopardize the relations with their family. So they're so hospitable that they give up the rights of their family. So for example, if you live in a home and you have 2 bedrooms, one for yourself and maybe your wife, and then another room for your mother, for example. And then somebody comes to visit you and somebody is traveling from outside. You have no idea who they are. You've never met them before. Because you are so hospitable, you kick out your mother to put that person in. So yeah, they were hospitable, but almost to a fault. And there's some crazy things that they would do. They would offer up their own spouses to travelers. They would enlist, prostitutes for travelers. They would serve alcohol and et cetera, et cetera. So as I mentioned, even though hospitality is a good quality, like many other qualities of the Arabs, when it's gone unchecked, when it's gone unguided, it can lead to a lot of harm. Another honorable trait of the Arabs is that they had sanctity of a person's word, right? People held to their word. People were very honest most of the time. There's no law, there's no court, there's no legal system. So a person's word was everything. And when poverty was rampant, people have nothing. So the only thing that they had was their honor. So people would not jeopardize their honor. Now, at least conceptually, idealistically, they had this concept of being opposed to injustice, even though it was rampant. The injustice was rampant, but what they saw as injustice was different from what was actual injustice. And that's why you will see that. But we'll talk about it at another time, but there's something called the Hijr al-Fudud, which was a treaty that was done before Revelation that the Prophet ﷺ was actually a part of, that was put into place to preserve people's rights. And Rasulullah ﷺ said that even after Islam came, if this Hijr al-Fudud took place again, I would 100% stand by it. They also had a lot of simplicity, right? The elites would have a lot of material, but the leaders found dignity and honor in slaughtering and skinning their own animals and cooking and serving it to people, right? They would sleep among the people by a fire, right? So since they were passionate and chaotic people, the Arabs admired this idea of serenity and composure in people since they were hard to come by. Literacy was not common among the pre-Islamic Arabs. There were maybe like 20 literate people in Mecca at the time of the Prophet's birth. But in spite of this, there was a great premium placed on knowledge itself, which carried through oral tradition. And again, this is one of those things that it was kind of like a circular, vicious cycle, where because the people were illiterate, they were very strong in memory and oral tradition, very, very strong. But because of their great oral tradition or reliance upon memory, they never developed a sense of urgency about learning how to read and write. Nowadays, it's completely flipped, that we are extremely literate. We have every knowledgeable thing accessed on our fingertips, but we can't memorize anything. We are, always struggling to remember things and constantly looking things up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, when people would travel to other parts of the world, they would bring back any new information that they can. So when they go to some place in the world, they would learn about astrology, they would bring it back. They learned about economy, they would bring it back. Agriculture, farming, history, they would bring it back and teach it to their circles and teach it to other individuals. So knowledge was a very expensive commodity, if you will, that people really loved knowledge. People really wanted to gain knowledge at that time. Now, at the same time, genealogy was also an expertise of these Arabs. So by the age of 4, a child could recite his own family tree by memory, going back 20 generations. They would even memorize the genealogy of their horses, not just their own family members, but they memorize the genealogy of the horses. There was also the oratory skills of the Arabs. They were very eloquent. When battles took place, you know what they would do? Instead of having 2 people come up and fight one another, in pre-Islamic Arabia, they would have 2 poets come up and basically literally rap battle. They would literally do a rap battle. They would recite poetry about each other, how we're better and your tribe sucks. And then the other person will respond, and then the battle would commence, right? And every year during Hajj, they would have competitions. And the poet who was the best poet of the time, or the best poet of the year, would get crowned the king of poetry, and whatever poem he recited would be hung on the Kaaba. It would be hung on the door of the Kaaba as an honor for that person. So as you can see, there's a lot of, things going on. A lot of negative qualities, some positive qualities. And as I mentioned before, just the term Arab itself, one of the meanings is what? One of the meanings is that it's a controlled chaos, right? It's a flowing river, but it's also chaotic in a sense. Now let's talk about the religion of these people, which we'll probably spend the rest of today's time talking about, inshallah. One of the first things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded the Prophet to do was to warn people. In Surah Yasin, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, so that you may warn people whose forefathers were not warned, and so they are heedless. So the Prophet ﷺ is described as being a nadhir, a warner. It's like a person who is walking and there's a ditch in their path up ahead. It's only a matter of time before that person falls into the ditch. So you warn him to look out for the ditch, or at least sincere, honest people would do so. People that have compassion for others would do so. And so the people, the Arabs, they had been without any spiritual guidance for a very long time. And Rasulullah ﷺ was not the first person to bring the message of honor to these people. Alayhi salam and his children, they were followers of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Tawheed. Now, after several generations has passed, idolatry was introduced to these people in Mecca. The very first person to introduce idolatry to Mecca and in the surrounding area of the Hijaz was someone by the name of Amr ibn Luhay. And he was a very cultural traveler. He traveled to Bilad al-Sham, Syria, and he loved their intelligence. He loved their advancement in technology. He loved how so-called civilized these people were. And he saw that they were worshiping idols. And so he connected the two. He said that the reason why these people are so successful is because they're worshiping idols. And so Amr, he brought back an idol named Hubal, which is the moon god, and would tell people to start worshiping the idols. Now, Amr ibn Luhay, the reason why he was so successful is because he was a scholar himself. He was very influential. He was a leader of his people. So he was able to basically get Arabs to start worshiping these idols. And a very vital lesson can be derived from this event. The Syrians were very powerful, specifically a tribe called the, I always butcher the pronunciation of this word, but it's called Amalekites, I think. I think that's how you pronounce it. And they were very successful, but they were pagans. They were idol worshippers. So Amr ibn Luhay's his inferiority complex, it led him to yearn to emulate their apparent success, and in turn, it destroyed an entire nation's faith. And so the lesson here that we can derive from this, because it's very relevant today, is technological and infrastructural advancements does not equate to moral and ethical correctness. Do not conflate the two. And because Amr ibn Luhay was a chieftain of his tribe, it also teaches us how scholars and influential figures can have a very profound impact on their community, whether good or bad. Right? And I talk about all the time how everybody's a leader in some capacity. You're either a father or a mother or a brother or a sister, or you maybe have managed people at work, whatever it may be. In some capacity, you have influence over another person. So it's very important to remember that you have a profound impact, whether positive or negative, with individuals. So there are 5 idols that the Arabs used to actively worship. And the names of these idols actually come in Surah Nuh, because Amr ibn Luhay, he was led, and Sahih Bukhari, the Prophet tells us that Amr ibn Luhay was led by a jinn to certain idols that were buried, and he unburied those idols. And those 5 idols were the same idols that the people of Nuh alayhi salam used to worship. And those idols are who? Right? We have Wadda, Suwa', Yaghūth, Ya'ūq, and Nasr. So the verse that comes, وَقَالُوا لَا تَذَرُنَّ آلِهَتَكُمْ وَلَا تَذَرُنَّ وَدًّا وَلَا سُوَعًا وَلَا يَغُوثَ وَيَعُوقَ وَنَسْرًا. Now these were the 5 idols that the Arabs used to actively worship. Now, there were some idols who had more significance than others. These idols would be placed in very strategic positions and strategic places around the Hijaz. And they were known as satellite locations of the main Kaaba. So they would have these idols, they would place them around the Arabian Peninsula and build sanctuaries, aka mini Kaabas, so people can go around these Kaabas. And that, as we see in Surah Al-Najm, أَفَرَأَيْتُمُ اللَّاتَ وَالْعُزَّى, وَمَنَاةَ الثَّالِثَةَ الْأُخْرَى. So there was Al-Lat, Al-Uzza, and Manat. Al-Lat was worshipped by the people of Ta'if. Uzza was worshipped in a region called Nakhla, which is near Mecca. And Manat was worshipped in Yathrib by the tribes of Aus and Khazraj, and Yathrib will later on be called Medina, right? Once Rasulullah and his companions moved there. Now, one thing I want to make clear here, the scholars do say that Yathrib, the name Yathrib, is not a respectful term for the city of Medina, right? Yathrib literally means, like a land of dirt, like a land where like nothing grows. And that's not a respectful term for the holy city of Medina, which is where our Prophet Muhammad is. So nowadays, it is technically a makruh thing to call it Yathrib. Okay, you do not call Medina Yathrib. You call it Medina Munawwara. Respect the city. However, in order to be true to I don't know why I'm blinking here, to the timeline of the Seerah, the scholars of Seerah will continue to call it Yathrib until it actually changes to Medina. So it becomes a clear distinction of what time we're talking about in this city. So although you might hear me say Yathrib, don't say Yathrib outside of this class. Don't call Medina Munawwara Yathrib. Show it the honor and respect that it deserves, which is Medina Munawwara. And there are many other idols that they were worshiping. The people of Taif were worshiping idols. The people of Yemen, the people of Banu Bakr were worshiping idols. There were as an idol that had a second in Yemen called Kaaba Yamaniya that was being worshipped there. People were being put to a tawaf over there. And it was rampant. It was just very, very rampant. And these people weren't just randomly worshiping idols. There was an effort to replicate the same vibe that was present in terms of the Kaaba. So the Kaaba itself, it's a sacred construction in a sacred land where the supreme being Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was worshipped. And there's a narration, Muslim Imam Ahmad, that states that when the Prophet ﷺ came in Fath Mecca, there were 360 plus idols that were around the Kaaba. People had idols in their homes. Different tribes would take the main idols to different regions. And so slowly the perversion and the deterioration of the religion and spirituality started to come about. Now, one thing that is important to note here is when it comes to the Muslims today, we do not believe that the Kaaba itself is sanctified. It's in a sacred place, but the Kaaba itself is not sanctified. The materials used for the Kaaba is brick, and clay, but rather Muslims believe in the sanctity of the location. Right? Not the marble floor that's in Masjid al-Haram, not the silk cloth that is over the Kaaba. These things don't hold any sacred value in Islam, except two parts of the Kaaba, the Yemeni corner and the black stone. Where Rasulullah ﷺ said in an authentic narration of Muslim Imam Ahmad that touching the black stone in the Yemeni corner indeed erases sins. So therefore, there is a blessing in touching the Yemeni corner, and there is a blessing in touching the black stone. Anywhere else in the Kaaba, there's no particular blessing in touching it. And the reason I mention this is because if you ever go there, you'll see a mob of people just trying to rush to touch the Kaaba, rubbing their face against the cloth, doing all sorts of things. But the cloth was made in a factory. Every year, they change the kiswa, the cloth of the Kaaba. It changes every year. It was made in a factory by some dude. I went there, I saw it myself. It's just some guy stitching it up. There's no sanctified thing. There's no particular blessing of the cloth of the Kaaba. And so it's important to know, because when you're there, what happens is you're not going to see just a few people do this. You're going to see a lot of people do this. A lot of people do this. And so you might get carried away. You might get swept up in the whole vibe and be like, oh, a lot of people are doing it. It must mean it's okay. I do it too. But no. What do we say? There's only two parts of the Kaaba. But if you have the blessing to touch, alhamdulillah. If you don't, that's okay too. It's not required. The Yemeni corner and the black stone. Another thing as well is don't bully and harass people to be able to touch these two things. If you're able to get to it in a calm manner, alhamdulillah. But if it causes you to hurt another individual or block the right of another individual, then there's no blessing in that. There's no blessing in that. There's no blessing in sinning to try to attain a blessing. Understood? Understood. Alhamdulillah. One thing that's important to note about the Arabs is that they believed in Allah. That's often a common misconception, right? So, for example, they just saw that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as whatever, what they would say is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is too holy for us and we're a bunch of sinners. So that means we need a lesser God that we can reach, and this lesser God can reach the main God, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And you'll see this actually a lot in the Quran, where it's clear that the Arabs did believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay. All right, now let's talk about some practices for these idols that they had. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Ma'idah, مَا جَعَ اللَّهُ مِن بَحِيرًا وَلَا سَائِبًا وَلَا وَصِيلًا وَلَا حَامٍ. What do these things mean? What Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, I have never ordained, Allah has never ordained the so-called bahira. Bahira is when the idol worshippers would take the milk of a she-camel and solely designating it as an offering for the idols. And the milk of the she-camel was off limits for anyone else. And sa'iba is where a she-camel would be let loose, would be free, and they would not be used for anything, no food, no transportation, no sacrifice, and it would roam freely solely for the sake of the gods. No one else can benefit from it. Then there's wasila, who is a male camel that would be used for any work that the idol needs. Sorry, no, that's ham. Ham is a male camel that would be used for any work that an idol needs, and would also be used to breed with a sa'iba to create a wasila. And a wasila was a she-camel that was set free for the idols, and the offsprings of a wasila were called a sa'iba. Now in a hadith, Rasulullah said that the first person to institute all these practices was who? The same dude, Amr ibn Luhay. This guy is a shaitan, man. Like, he created a lot of fitna. Another practice that existed before Islam was that even when they had to make major decisions, the Arabs would gamble by launching marked arrows. So a couple examples that they would do here. Either they would launch 2 arrows at the same time at the same target, and whichever hits the target or hits closer to the center of the target, that's the decision that they're going to make, right? They would mark the arrows. Another is they would fire the arrows in the air, and whichever one lands first, that would be the decision that they would make. Another one is they would release birds, and then whichever direction that the bird would fly in, that's how they would make their decisions. Just weird stuff. And so you start to see all these different types of things. You start to see how the pre-Islamic Arabia started to become very distorted and perverted in religion. And even what made it even worse is that the original message of Christianity and Judaism of the time also became perverted. Surah Al-Ma'idah talks about how the rabbis were altering the decision. They would put the Torah aside themselves, and they themselves, the rabbis, became the source of the religion of the people. Right? Even if you ask today, any Jewish synagogue, you go to the rabbis, you ask them, how does rabbinical law come about? The person that has the supreme decision in rabbinical law is the rabbi. And the source is seen as inspiration. The Torah is seen as inspiration, but not the decree. The decree comes from the rabbi. And so we have that distortion. And Surah Al-Ma'idah also addresses how the Christians distorted the original message in saying that Jesus is Allah, and Allah is the Messiah, the Son of Mary, etc., etc., etc. So even though there was pockets of Judaism at the time and Christianity that existed at the time, they were not the original forms of Judaism and Christianity. And the pagans' justification for worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it was what they said, that we know we come from a tradition that tells us to worship one God, Allah, and we're okay with that. We still haven't let go of Allah. We still worship and believe in Allah. However, we feel that areas. So the belief that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, was that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself put these idols in charge of different things. So they have an idol for rain, an idol for childbearing, an idol for crops, and etc. But these idols eventually began to become the object of people's soul worship. So many times they even ended up forgetting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala altogether. For example, in Surah Surah Zumar, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَئِنْ سَأَلْتَهُمْ مَنْ خَلَقَ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ لَيَقُولُنَّ اللَّهُ. That if you ask them who created the heavens and the earth, they will certainly say that it is Allah who created the heavens and the earth. So they knew who Allah was, but they were just still rampant in idol worship. A lot of notes here, but we're only in 10 minutes. I'm trying to get to the things that are a little bit more relevant. Okay, let's talk about. Okay. So being a kahin or a soothsayer was also very prevalent. People that would come and claim that they know what the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, and then they would go around and basically be a soothsayer. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed, and so this is important because one of the first things that people insulted the Prophet ﷺ with was referring to him as a soothsayer, as a kahin. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says in Surah Al-Haqqa, وَلَا بِقَوْلِ كَاهِنٍ قَلِيلًا مَا تَذَكَّرُونَ, that this Quran is not the word of a soothsayer, little do you remember. Now there was this other man, his name is Abu Kabsha. Abu Kabsha was the first person to bring astrology back to the Arabs. And he traveled to other parts of the world and he found astrology. And when he came back, he tried to get the Arabs to disregard their idol worship and worship a star called Seerah, Cyrus, right? Also known as the Cyrus star. And it's interesting because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Najm, he's the one himself, he says, وَأَنَّهُ هُوَ رَبُّ الشِّعْرَى, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the Rabb of Seerah. So Abu Kabsha, he told the idols to stop worshiping, or told the Arabs to stop worshiping the idols and just worship Seerah. And so when the Prophet Muhammad told the people to stop worshiping the idols and the suns and the moons and the stars and just worship only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, he was accused of being the son of Abu Kabsha. They would say, oh, Abu Kabsha also tried to stop us from worshiping the idols. And sorry, you're just like that guy. You're Ibn Kabsha. Right? And you're trying to stop us from worshiping idols and worship your gods. So to refute that claim, that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed this with the Najm, that وَأَنَّهُ هُوَ رَبُّ الشِّعْرَى. And the Prophet ﷺ is not telling you to worship a star. The Prophet ﷺ is not telling you to worship anything else except for the one that created Seerah. He's the one he's the Lord of Seerah. He's the Lord, the one who created that star. Now, remnants of the teachings of the prophets of the past still remain in that present society. There are a few things that the pagans were still doing correctly in terms of proper worship. So, for example, they believed in Allah, even though they had a twisted mentality of the idols went back to Allah. They believed that the Kaaba was a supreme place. They would go do Hajj, even though it's a distorted form of Hajj. They would visit Mina and Arafah. They saw Safa and Marwa as sacred places, sacred regions. They still thought that there was something special about the well of Zamzam. They venerated Maqam Ibrahim. They respected and they kissed the Hajar al-Aswad, the black stone, for blessings. And even though they followed the remnants of the original Hajj, they had these twisted practices. So the Kaaba was seen as a sacred place. That if you're not from the Quraysh, you were seen as something that is filthy. So if you're not from the Quraysh and you wanted to go worship the Kaaba, you would have to purchase clean clothes from the Quraysh, which was actually just a scam because it was just an opportunity for the Quraysh to get rich. So the Quraysh would make all these clothes and they would sell them for large amounts of money. And if the pilgrims couldn't afford the clothing, what would happen? Anybody know? You would just have to go out to Hajj nude. You would have to walk around nude. And they couldn't do anything because they couldn't do the Hajj in their own dirty clothing. And there's actually authentic narration the Prophet talks about this. Now another distorted thing, Surah Al-Anfal, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا كَانَ صَلَاتُهُمْ عِنْدَ الْبَيْتِ إِلَّا مُكَاءً وَلَا تَصْدِيًا. that their sacred worship that they would do. So what do we do when we do tawaf? And we do dhikr, we do dua, we praise Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the things that we want, for Jannah and protection from the hellfire and even things of the dunya that we may want, no problem. But what they would do is they would whistle and clap while they're running around the tawaf and doing tawaf. Now, they would also, the good thing they would do, the Quraysh would do, is they would serve the Kaaba, right? They would clean it, they would take care of it, they would give water to the Hujjaj. These were held as virtuous practice that they did, even though they twisted a lot of other practices. Another thing that would happen very, very frequently in this time is that there would be a lot of civil wars between these tribes, generations upon generations of civil wars. And they would specifically have wars about who will be caretakers of the Kaaba. Because even though the good that remained with them from the original practices, it was twisted in that way that, like I mentioned before, they would hurt the rights of other individuals to try to do a virtuous practice, and which no longer makes it virtuous. So because the Quraysh were inhabitants of Mecca and caretakers of the Kaaba, and they gave water to the Hujjaj, they held a very special place of leadership and reverence in the eyes of all the other tribes. The Quraysh, the tribe of Quraysh, were seen as superior since they were the hosts of the Hujjaj. And in pre-Islamic Arabian society, you'll see that religion, although had a symbolic sacredness, in reality, it was also made a joke and a mockery. So this is important because we need to understand what role does religion have for these people. So if we look today, for example, our deen is central in our lives. Our deen dictates everything that we do. From the moment that I wake up to the moment that I go to sleep, I have an example in the Prophet ﷺ of how to do everything I do. Everything I do with the intention of Allah. My life revolves around religion. Religion doesn't revolve around my life. But in America, right, especially with non-Muslim religions, there's a lot of discussion about whether a person should dictate their life based on religion or not, or whether religion is a personal thing or not. But in Islam, yeah, religion is personal, but not really. It's your life. It dictates everything that you do. It's a full guide. It's not something that you pick up on a Friday and then leave till next Friday. Like Christianity, where you pick up on Sunday and then you leave till next Sunday. Or that we change it based on our society or based on our times. No, the idea of separation of church and state does not belong in our deen. Our policies, our rules, the way we conduct ourselves is heavily influenced based on our religion. And that's a good thing, because our religion is divine. It comes from Allah and His Messenger. And so why would you want anything else other than Allah and His Messenger dictating your life? Now, an example of how they just made the religion a mockery comes when we're talking about the sacred months. How the sacred months, they were not allowed to fight during these sacred months. They were supposed to cease fighting during the sacred months. But again, the sacred months in the Islamic calendar are months in the year where there are certain blessings and there are certain things that you're not supposed to do. And one of those things is war. You're not supposed to go to war. You're not supposed to fight during the sacred months. But because they would like to twist the religious beliefs, even though they had the concept of sacred months, if a war was about to be over, but a sacred month was fast approaching, they will just delay the month. They will have a marker and observe, they will say, no, we'll just bring forward one of the unholy months. And Surah At-Tawbah mentions this practice, how they would postpone the sacred months so that they can increase in their disbelief, excuse me. So for example, if we look at the Gregorian calendar as an example, let's say October is a sacred month, okay? And we're fighting a battle, but October is here in 4 days. And if we keep pushing through, then the battle should be wrapped up in about 2 weeks. If we keep pushing through, the battle will be wrapped up in 2 weeks. So what we're going to do is, instead of stop fighting, we're going to delay October and we're going to bring November forward, because November is not a sacred month. But once we wrap up the battle in 2 weeks, we will mark and observe October afterwards. And next year we will put October back in its original place. But it turns out that the battle actually raged on for 6 weeks and not 2 weeks, as originally thought. No problem. We got this under control. December hasn't come yet. We'll bring December forward. The problem is, though, is December is a sacred month. Oh, snap. But January is not. Okay, let's bring January forward. So now we brought November forward and we put October behind, and now we will bring forward January, but we will put December behind. Does that make sense? No, because it's not supposed to, right? It's a complete mess. It's complete chaos. It's a complete mess of the order. So the next year rolls around and no one can remember which month was delayed and which one was brought forward, which one was brought back. So then they had a very hard time of tracking time and switching months all the time, and it became a mess. And this is just an example of how religion was marginalized. They allowed it as for certain symbolic sacredness, but they would conveniently switch it around to get what they want. Again, reflect here. Pre-Islamic Arabia is not much different than today, unfortunately. How many religions around the world do we see folding and succumbing to pressure to change because the religion isn't ideal or it messes with the status quo or whatever it may be? How many Christian churches do we see folding to the LGBTQ ideology? Or Jewish synagogues? Just picking what is convenient about the religion and leaving off the rest. And this is very important. Because again, as I mentioned in the beginning, pre-Islamic Arabia was what? The darkest time that we have ever seen, society-wise. And not modern day, we see so many similarities between pre-Islamic Arabia and modern day, but people call it what? People call it what today is what? Progress. Progressive. We're progressing. Reflect on this. And so what's beautiful about our Seerah journey is we're going to see what true progress looks like. How Rasulullah took a society that had a lot of corruption, had a lot of misunderstanding, had a lot of wrong ideologies, and brings about morality, brings about ethics, and turns them into the greatest society known to man. So we look at today's society and we're not over here thinking, oh, we're doomed because of this and that. No, we have an example in Rasulullah of how to bring the society back. And we can do it, no matter how few number that we are. No matter how so-called weak infrastructure or dunya things that we may have, doesn't matter. Could you imagine if the 800 companions in the battle of Khandaq looked at the 10,000 soldiers on the other side of the trench and said, what's the point? Could you imagine if the companions in the battle of Badr looked over and saw that they were outnumbered ×3 and the heavy artillery weapons that the other side had and they didn't have? Because we'll get to it, inshallah, in the future. But the companions weren't prepared for the Battle of Badr. They didn't have their armor. Many of them didn't have their swords or their weapons. Some of them just took some branches off a tree and fought with that. Could you imagine if they looked at the other side and say, what's the point? We're outnumbered. The odds are against us. Could you imagine where we would be today? Right? Yemen wouldn't have been a Muslim country. Egypt wouldn't have been a Muslim country. And so I would be lost. I don't know where I would be right now. So when we're looking at the Seerah, a way we can apply it today is see that no. Even though there might be some messed up things of society, for us to say, oh, this doomed, this destroyed, all that stuff, the Prophet said that the one that says the people are destroyed is the one who is destroyed. Right? We don't lose hope. No, we can be the people that bring people back to moral and ethics and call people to moral and ethics, no problem. Okay. There's a funny story here of a tribe by the name of Banu Hanifa. They're not associated with Imam Abu Hanifa, by the way, right? But they used to make idols out of a certain type of sweet, like a cake or a halwa type of thing. And so they would carve out these idols made out of cake or dates or fats of animals or milk and etc. And they would worship the idols until it rotted and insects ate it, and they would build a new one. One year there was a drought that hit the region, and people eventually got hungry. So they ate their idols. Okay? Just to show how interesting that time was. And a poet actually saw the people eating their idols, and he said in a poem, the people of the Hanifa ate their Rabb in a time of severe starvation and drought. They were not afraid of their Lord, and how horrible of followers were these people, and how pathetic their Rabb was, that eating the idol didn't strike fear into their hearts. And this is what the status was of religion in pre-Islamic Arabia before Islam. So the Prophet ﷺ, he was there and put into place to raise, to train, to teach the people and fulfill the covenant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Muslims in the Prophet ﷺ's times were the same people who originally used to make such mockery of the religion. Again, people can change. People can be for the better. The same Muslims that the same people that ate their own idols are the same people that we look up to today. People can change. And the Prophet ﷺ, what he was doing, he was able to accomplish this by inspiring people. He didn't show up and just start bashing and trashing their idols. The Prophet inspired and motivated people. He is a Siraj al-Munira. He's this certain light that came about. The Prophet Muhammad was. And so Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we even see in the Quran, he is the result of Ibrahim alayhi salam's dua. Ibrahim alayhi salam, he said, رَبَّنَا بَعَثْ فِيهِمْ رَسُولًا مِّنْهُمْ يَتْلُو عَلَيْهِمْ آيَاتِكَ وَيُعَلِّمُهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةَ وَيُزَكِّيهِمْ إِنَّكَ أَنْتَ الْعَزِيزُ الْحَكِيمُ. But oh Allah, bring about from these people, the Arabs, someone who will recite your book and teach them your book. And this doesn't stop there. No, he will teach them wisdom. You'll teach them how to be purified, and etc., etc., etc. One of the most beautiful things about Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is that, and many mufassirun say that there's differences of opinion about what was the second verses that were revealed after Iqra. And one of those opinions is actually a verse from Surah Al-Qalam, وَإِنَّكَ لَعَلَى خُلُقٍ عَظِيمٍ. That, oh, Rasulullah, it's the Prophet Muhammad, it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala telling the Prophet Muhammad that you truly are a man of outstanding character. And there's a poem by Hassan bin Thabit, radiallahu ta'ala anhu, where he says, وَأَجْمَلُ مِنْكَ لَمْ تَرَ قَطُّ عَيْنٍ. That there is nothing more beautiful that my eyes have ever laid upon. وَأَطْيَبُ مِنْكَ لَمْ تَلِدِ النِّسَاء. There is nothing more pure, more blessed, more amazing than you. There's no woman that has ever given birth to anything more amazing and more blessed than you. خُلِقْتَ مُبَرَّأً مِنْ كُلِّ عَيْبٍ. You were created free from flaw. كَأَنَّكَ قَدْ خُلِقْتَ كَمَا تَشَاءُ. As if you were created the way that you want. Meaning what? Meaning that you were uniquely created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You were created with perfection. That if someone had come and wanted to create the perfect individual, then they still would not be able to match the beauty that is Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And his beauty, as we described last week, was not just external, but it was also internal as well. Now, okay, we'll conclude here, inshallah. And next week, we'll talk about a group of people who are referred to as the Hunafa. There are a group of people who were monotheists during the time of pre-Islamic Arabia. There's a few, right? There's a few individuals who did not practice shirk, who believed in Tawheed, and they called people towards Tawheed. Even before Rasulullah was born, even after he was born, up until his prophethood. So we'll talk next week about individuals that were of the Hunafa, and especially the four most prominent ones who were Waraqa bin Nawfal, Ubaydullah ibn Jahsh, Uthman ibn al-Huwayrith, and Zayd ibn Amr. These four individuals specifically. Yeah, tamam. All right, before we conclude, any questions? I know this stuff isn't the most exciting stuff in the world, but I promise you it's super important to learn the background before we're introduced to Rasulullah. Right? Wallahi, I promise you it's going to make you fully appreciate his life when we approach it this way, inshallah. Any questions? Brothers, sisters? No? Yes?
The two sacred parts of the Kaaba, what is the reason they're how are they established?
So we have a narration, Rasulullah says that, authentic narration, Muslim Imam Ahmad, that indeed the one that touches the Yemeni corner or the black stone, their sins are erased. So we know that to be a fact, right? So that's clear, that's cut. Now, why they are specifically blessed? I'm not sure about the Yemeni corner, but I know that the black stone, it was sent down from the heavens, right? When Ibrahim alayhi salam built the Kaaba, there was like a final piece that was missing. And so that black stone was sent to be that final piece. And what's interesting is the black stone was actually what? What color? Does anybody know? White. But what happened? Right? It turned black the moment it hit the dunya because of the sins that are in the dunya. Right? SubhanAllah. Any questions? No, or sorry, okay, you had a question? Very good. Any other questions? Just for a sec. No. Brothers? Okay. Tamam. Jazakallah khair, everyone. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون والسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته